All right. So when I last left off talking about Vietnam, I was ending right as the bell was ringing, talking about how the U.S. Had kind of given kind of a nod to the South Vietnamese military to remove Diem because of his corruption, and the whole idea was that they realized Diem was complicating matters in Vietnam and making it much harder for them to kind of control the Viet Cong. And so the end result of this is going to be a South Vietnamese government that is not stable, that is having to rely very heavily on U.S. aid and U.S. advisors and U.S. military. Um, and then, of course, I showed you the picture of the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire. And I think that I had, if I remember correctly, I had mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and how that really kind of redefined the power, the separation of powers, and allowing the president to basically do whatever he wanted, to take all measures necessary. And so this is really kind of the foundation for Vietnam. Again, domino theory, containment, these are the big ideas behind it. But in a practical sense, as far as like the immediate action, it's going to be the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, allowing LBJ to start sending in lots of troops. Beginning in 1965. So we're going to start increasing our presence there. You're going to have the Operation Rolling Thunder in March of 65, with the American soldiers having to push the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh, or rather the Viet Minh. They will be fighting Viet Cong as well. But the Viet Cong, of course, blend in with the general population of South Vietnam, whereas the Viet Minh are coming from North Vietnam. But again, you try to pick out who was from North Vietnam and who is from South Vietnam. I mean, you're not talking about people looking particularly different or having a different skin tone or something like that. So it's going to be a much more difficult kind of battle. Understand too that the Viet Cong, these kind of terrorist groups, insurrectionists, whatever term you want to call them, they resort to these kind of ambushes, these booby traps, guerrilla tactics. And we're really going to consider that. I mean, if you compare it with, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, insurrectionists and, these explosions and all this kind of stuff. So it's very much the same kind of thing. And be sure that you're aware of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because this is going to matter a lot when we get to Nixon and his reactions in trying to bring about an end to Vietnam. And, so the use of napalm, Agent Orange, those are real problems. And so for American soldiers, I think I had pointed out that that they're having a lot of trouble figuring out, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. And they're also having a lot of trouble. I mean, you have this real expansion of drug usage among the soldiers. There's just a great deal of frustration. And of course, one of the problems you have with Vietnam is that we have a draft, but we also, with this draft, have exclusions for people who are going to school. And if you have a family that has some money or some connections, you can get a gig fulfilling your draft obligations with the National Guard, for instance. And if you do those things, what tends to happen is that the people that are being drafted and sent to Vietnam often are overrepresentative of people of color, and certainly the poor and the working class. So if you're, middle class, upper middle class, wealthy, you're probably not fighting in Vietnam, or if you are, you're going over there after you've graduated college and you're an officer, and so you're not marching and traipsing through the jungle. So this is one of the problems with Vietnam, is that you have this definite, almost kind of class-based system with the draft that really is part of the resentment that will begin to build overall. And so just be sure you understand kind of how all of this is building. You get through 1965 into 66. And again, you're having this sense of why can't we beat these people, right? These are, they don't have the technology, they don't have the organization, but we can't seem to beat them. And that's largely because Vietnam is not being fought, as I mentioned before, to take over North Vietnam. It's being fought to preserve democracy and prevent communism and to support South Vietnam. And these are, goals that are very difficult to define. These aren't things that you can say, well, go take that hill over there, or, we need to defeat this particular army. And then, of course, it's all being complicated by the fact we're increasing resentment among the South Vietnamese population, pushing more and more of those people into the arms of the Viet Cong, and encouraging them to basically, help resist the Americans. Understand that the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh are being aided by the Communist Chinese, and to a lesser extent, the Soviet Union. Understand that Asian communism is not sure that it really likes Soviet communism that much. There's a lot of nervousness that the Soviets are going to try to exert Western influence. So there's a lot of with China, Vietnam, any of these Asian countries, they're very wary of kind of that outside influence. And so even though they have communism in common, they're not going to be very interested in having too much Soviet control. So the Soviets do have some, material relevance as far as Vietnam is concerned, but it's really going to be China and the communists there that are going to be a problem, which really speaks to our larger problem of not fully understanding Chinese communism and not really understand, and this goes back to, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and how the United States had really kind of shut the door on a relationship with them, until all of a sudden we decide that it serves our purpose to be on friendly terms with China. And by then it's too late. We don't understand the nature of China. And so it's not going to be until Nixon comes in that we're going to actually kind of fix that. So be sure that you understand Vietnam is a proxy war, that it is kind of this conflict that is about all of these ideas of the Cold War, that we've got to prevent the spread of communism. We've got to uphold democracy wherever we find it. And the problem with that is we don't ask very hard questions about how successful, how valid that democracy really is. And you can see here just kind of a general map of North Vietnam, South Vietnam. This red line right here is going to be the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So when I'm talking about supplies coming from North Vietnam, this is where they're coming from. And so they travel through Laos and Cambodia into kind of areas in South Vietnam where they're able to fight. And so we're going to see that, and these black arrows are some incursions trying to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, stop the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh. And so that's kind of where that comes from. And then you also have the X's there are some key battles. 1968 is going to be the major year that we see with Vietnam. This is largely because you have a major offensive by the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh in January of 68. So here we are. 65, you have Operation Rolling Thunder. 66, 67, we've got increasing troop levels, increasing actions, all this kind of stuff. In January of 68, you have this major attack into South Vietnam. And basically, the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh attack U.S. air bases. They attack Vietnamese cities, get almost all the way down to Saigon, as a matter of fact. And it takes the United States about 4 weeks to push this attack back into North Vietnam. Now, ultimately, we are successful in pushing them back, right? And so we do a pretty good job once we get them on the defensive. But the problem is it takes us 4 weeks to do this. And to the American mindset, this is a shock, right? You've been telling us that we've got this under control, that the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh aren't very well prepared. We have all this modern technology and we keep sending more and more young boys over there. And then boom, all of a sudden in January, there's this major offensive. So what does that tell us about how successful we're being there, right? And you can see what some of the casualties were. And a lot of this, 1968 is going to be the year that really the American public disengages from supporting this war. And part of this, Walter Cronkite famously had said that, that the Vietnam War was lost in the living rooms of America. And he famously gives a report, and I think it's in 68, where basically he says that that he doesn't understand why we're even there, right? And that nobody understands why, and that he thinks this war is a bad idea. And when he does this, right, LBJ says, well, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. So you have a lot of television coverage of these battles, and with the Tet Offensive, there's all these images of these wounded soldiers and the struggles over there, and so this is really going to make the Americans really feel frustrated with this conflict and kind of this war of attrition, if you will. The fact that we never quite seem, to get ahead in Vietnam. And like I said, the media coverage is incredibly important with Vietnam, and so you cannot mistake that as being kind of a major factor. And there's all kinds of news reels and all kinds of stuff about Vietnam. Lots of casualties in 1968. Of course, we've had a lot more soldiers by 1968 over in Vietnam, but the Tet Offensive is a big part of this, and and it just leads to a lot of questions. And we'd seen that anti-war protests had started pretty early in the process, pretty early by 1965. 68, you have a lot of anti-war protests. By the time you get to 69, you're starting to talk about Woodstock and the Summer of Love and the hippies and the counterculture movement. And this all kind of gets embroiled in the anti-war protesters. So it's very simplistic to say, well, these were all these hippie anti-war people. Well, there's actually a lot more nuance than that, because you could be counterculture and really be so involved in being removed from the culture that you're not even concerned about whether or not there's a war. You could also be virulently anti-war and, not be a hippie. So that, understand that it's easy to kind of generalize these groups. But you do have this trend towards anti-war protesting that becomes much more vocal, much more violent. You have a lot more confrontations between, young people, students, and the police, and that's going to catch some attention. So here people are sitting at home watching, these young soldiers being injured, watching the effects of the Tet Offensive, seeing what these anti-war protests are about, and they're just really just kind of shattered by all this. And so it's really kind of a big deal. The Paris peace talks will begin in 1968, but they don't actually achieve anything until you get to 1973, when we finally have a ceasefire agreement. So yeah, almost 5 years of talking before they finally figure out a way to get us out. The My Lai massacre is going to happen in August of 68. So this is, several months after the Tet Offensive. The My Lai massacre is one of several instances of atrocities by American soldiers against the South Vietnamese. Now, obviously, that statement alone makes it sound very simplistic. The My Lai massacre is clearly an incident of, young soldiers who are frustrated, who, are having trouble distinguishing between, who are the innocent civilians that I'm trying to help and who are the people that are going to turn around tomorrow and start firing weapons at us. And so they get a little bit out of hand, and they kill some women and children and some elderly people. And of course, the real crime with the My Lai massacre is that, really no one is brought to justice for that. The two soldiers they find responsible, I think, basically kind of get a slap on the wrist in essence. And, we see these same kinds of things happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you have soldiers that make mistakes or that kind of snap a little bit and use bad judgment. Unfortunately, that kind of bad judgment affects a group of people. And we're kind of the people that are invading that territory, taking over. And remember, we're doing these things both in Vietnam and in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're doing these things in order to promote democracy, protect democracy, right? Extend these freedoms that are so important to the United States, except for these individuals, whether you're talking about Milei or some random group of people, and somebody, has gotten shot in Iraq. They don't see it as that way. For them, it's not about democracy. It's about, you've killed people that I love. And so this is a very complicated issue. But it's the things like Miley massacre are going to be kind of the foundation for why the anti-war protesters are going to kind of broadly label Vietnam vets as baby killers and that kind of thing. And that's really unfortunate because, you're talking about a very small group of soldiers that actually commit any atrocities. Most of these soldiers are just trying to survive. They're trying to keep from being addicted to drugs. They're trying to find a way to hold their sanity together and get back home. And so this is not, this assumption that just because you went to go fight in Vietnam, you were all excited about shooting at people is completely false. And this is one of the big things that has really tainted the anti-war movement and even kind of what I would consider the liberal left, kind of the new left side of 60s and 70s politics, is because they were so judgmental when it came to the veterans that they really kind of lacked an understanding of, the complexity of what it meant to go fight. And that's incredibly unfortunate. And I think in a lot of ways we've kind of compensated for that. You certainly see now that we, honor and respect veterans, regardless of whether or not we think the reason why they're there is just, or if we agree with the politicians that have sent them. We recognize that the guys doing the fighting are not necessarily, they're just there doing their job. And so I think that has been an improvement. We did learn a lesson from the treatment of Vietnam vets. So you have kind of this, 1968 is a really dark year. It's an election year. LBJ will choose not to run, mostly because the public has so turned against him. Now there's other things going on that we'll touch on more when we get to the human rights part of this. You're going to have, LBJ by 68 has lost the Deep South because of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. His Great Society programs have kind of created a drain on the economy, and you have a lot of middle-class people that are feeling a little bit frustrated, with the tax dollars and feeling like they don't have enough to show for it. And a lot of this is made worse by the fact that you have some riots happening that have to do with economic inequality. And so a lot of people are feeling very frustrated by that. So you want to be sure that, sorry for my dog. So you want to be sure that you kind of understand that, the reasons why LBJ is not going to run. And it has a whole lot to do with Vietnam. I remember going to a seminar once where they were talking to, it was actually Lady Bird Johnson's, LBJ's wife, her secretary. And she was saying what a challenge they had scheduling entertainment in like 67 and 68 because, so many of the musicians and artists were, incredibly anti-war. And, they either refused to perform for the White House or, they couldn't be trusted to behave themselves, And so it's just kind of an interesting insight into what it was like to be LBJ in 1968. So he will refuse to accept the Democratic Party nomination. Now, what this will do is open up the field for Robert Kennedy. Now, Robert Kennedy, of course, was John F. Kennedy's brother. And remember me saying he was the one that was really kind of the civil rights person of the two of them. And he really begins to gather momentum going into the summer of 68. Unfortunately, he gets shot at a hotel in California. And when that happens, of course, people are very shocked, and really the Democratic Party loses a lot of steam. He was really kind of the only person that could have overcome LBJ and his involvement in getting us sucked into that conflict. And so the Democratic Party just can't recover from that. 1968 is also the year that Martin Luther King will be killed. So 68 is a really bad year, all around, whether you're talking about Vietnam, whether you're talking about domestic issues. If you were alive in 68, you probably felt like the world was losing its mind. And so understand that in 1968, Nixon will win. He'll run for the presidency again. He will win pretty handily. And one of the reasons that Nixon will win is that he will promise to get the Americans out of the war. And so he will do this by promising this idea of Vietnamization, that we're going to start pulling our troop levels down and we're going to start turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese. Now, this sounds an awful lot like what we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then as now, it doesn't work exactly. It's not as simple as all that, right? But it's kind of this idea of weaning South Vietnam off of American support. And you can see that the troop levels in 1969 were at, 500,000. And so Nixon will start to withdraw the troops. You need to know the term Vietnamization. And that's a very important term. And then you'll see by 1970, Nixon will start bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia and Laos. And he'll do this even though we're not actually fighting Cambodia and Laos. There's no issues there. We don't have any domino theory going on. Now, understand that we were concerned about Cambodia and Laos because part of the domino theory was if Vietnam fell, then those two countries would fall. And you'd have this entire kind of peninsula area that's under communist control. So we were concerned about that. But very clearly he starts this massive bombing campaign. And what will happen is that Americans, especially young students and that kind of stuff, will get very mad because what they'll say is you promised to de-escalate. And you're not. You're increasing bombing. Of course, from Nixon's perspective, he's bringing troops home. And for him, that's the priority. How can I find a way to guarantee us victory in Vietnam and still find a way to bring troops home? So he's relying on this bombing campaign. This is what's going to trigger the Kent State shooting. The Kent State shooting happens at Kent State in Ohio. You have students that are protesting the bombing. They were also protesting some other stuff. It's kind of, protests by 1970 were generally they were for one particular reason, but they often ended up representing a lot of different things. So you have all these students protesting primarily the bombing in Cambodia and Laos. And the National Guard is going to get a little trigger happy and they're going to fire into the crowd. And you're going to have 9 students injured in this process. And it's going to really shock people, right? Understand that when Nixon's running in 1968, he's campaigning on this promise of law and order. I'm going to bring law and order back to society. And again, 1968 was a very tumultuous year. So here he is saying, I'm going to bring stability back and all this kind of stuff. And the American public was ready for that. They were ready to get out of Vietnam. They were ready for peace and order. There was a great deal of frustration with society. The economy is starting to lag a little bit by 1970. And so you've got a lot of stuff going on domestically. And so the Kent State shooting is going to be very shocking to a lot of people. Ultimately, Nixon will win in 1972. Of course, by 1972, he's continuing to bring home more soldiers, and so that's starting to help. Again, you can see here that news media was incredibly important, really very critical of the war, really shaped public opinion. And so this is a war that's shaped by the media in a way that we had never seen before. Everything we had seen with World War I and World War II, the media was often used as kind of a form of propaganda that was actually encouraged patriotism and encouraged the positives. And they didn't always show the most gory pictures from the battles. In fact, there were only a few battles in World War II that they really kind of broadly published, combat pictures. But that is not the case in Vietnam. And so that really kind of shapes the American public. What will happen, the next major development that's, happening during Nixon's first term in regards to Vietnam is going to be the release of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, it's a report issued or asked for by the State Department um, that is meant to kind of chronicle how we got involved in Vietnam. How did we get in this big mess, right? And it really kind of, what this report tells us is that the Johnson administration had lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that they had not been forthcoming with Congress or the American public. And it really makes, especially LBJ, but also John F. Kennedy, look kind of bad, like they had been, not watching what they were doing, that they had, not been completely honest with people. And so it really makes them look super, super bad. Now, Nixon, of course, it doesn't necessarily make Nixon look bad because this is chronicling the history of involvement. So this is all happening before Nixon becomes president. But Nixon's attitude is, how dare Ellsberg do this, right? That Ellsberg should have had more loyalty to the government. He shouldn't have tarnished the government's reputation. And under Nixon, they're actually going to try to put him on trial for violating the Espionage Act of 1917, right? Remember, this is part of that, Schenck v. U.S., that during times of war, the Constitution means different things. Now, what will happen is the trial will be dismissed, right? Because ultimately they'll say that the FBI in their investigation violated Ellsberg's civil liberties. So that it ends up going nowhere. But this was really a big deal in 1971. With Ellsberg kind of releasing the Pentagon Papers, and really kind of, again, confirms to the American public, who had already decided after 1968 that this whole thing was a gigantic cluster, right? It was such a mess. But, when they have the release of the Pentagon Papers, the American public's just done. We're just, out. We went out of Vietnam right away. We have the beginning of this real significant distrust of the government. The 1970s are marked by this distrust of the system and of politicians. And, of course, Watergate's not going to help that any, which we'll be talking about more later. But it begins with the Pentagon Papers in a lot of ways. And we also see that the treatment of Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers is an indication of Nixon's and his administration's willingness to play a little fast and loose with the laws. As president, he's supposed to uphold the law. But we see that, in 1971, 72, really, they kind of take this attitude that the White House is above the law. And this will really, this will destroy Nixon eventually by 1973. But you definitely see that this is part of Nixon's paranoia, part of why he's going to record every conversation and all this kind of stuff. So again, this all fits within Nixon's kind of MO. But it is also kind of a piece of what this whole, Vietnam story is, and the fact that we were lied to. And the fact that you have this major cynicism by the American public. And of course, remember the number of young people. This is a photo of the National Guard at Kent State. And of course, this is this won the Pulitzer Prize for, it showed one of the victims at Kent State who had been shot. And so, yes, it's definitely, definitely a period when you have a lot of young people who are very angry and very frustrated. Of course, remember that in the 1960s, you had to be 21 to vote, right? It's not until, 74, I think, is the 26th Amendment, when they changed the voting age down to 18. But in 1970, 1972, that was not the case. And of course, this is really unfair because it's 18 and 19-year-olds that are being drafted. And so there's a lot of anger over all of this. And so young people are a big part of the anti-war movement. And again, remember the impact of the baby boom. This is a large generation of people. There's a lot of them. And that's part of what shapes kind of the culture and the attitudes and kind of the openness and the change and all that kind of stuff, because there's such a large group of people. So the end of American involvement in Vietnam, we're going to continue to bring troops home, and we're going to continue to increase bombing all the way into 1972. And so Nixon will continue every time the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong do something that he doesn't like. He, bombs North Vietnam, he bombs Cambodia and Laos, and it gets really, really nasty. Even though we're bringing the troops home, and people are glad we're bringing the troops home, but they also just want us to not be involved at all. So in late 1972, Nixon's going to order another massive bombing campaign. Again, 1972 is going to be an election year. This is about the time of the Watergate break-in. Of course, Watergate hasn't been, the story's not out there yet, but this is the time when it happens. So Nixon orders this massive bombing campaign in Hanoi. You have more protest happening. Of course, he's going to win the 72 election, largely because people, trust his. First off, people are still kind of irritated at the Democrats, and the Democrats, I think it was Hubert Humphrey, I think, was running against him. Don't really have a strong candidate running, and Nixon's going to make this claim that there's a silent majority of Americans that actually support what he's doing, that support his assertion that the Vietnamization is working, that he's bringing troops home, that all we're doing is sending bombing campaigns in order to support the South Vietnamese army. And so he kind of makes this case for this silent support. And, and maybe in 72, he's got that. I think that's very possible. But certainly by the time you get to 1973, he's lost a whole lot of it. And so just kind of be sure that you're aware of kind of this process. By January of 73, they finally agree to a ceasefire, and the U.S. will begin withdrawal of all U.S. forces. You have the release of prisoners of war and that kind of thing. This is where hey, sweetie. This is where John McCain comes in. He was held captive in Hanoi for some time, and he comes home because of this. And what's going to happen is that the South Vietnamese were supposed to be able to determine their own future. But the North Vietnamese could keep troops in the South, which, should raise some question marks. By the end of 1973, almost all U.S. military personnel had left. In November of 73, Congress kind of has calls a mulligan on that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They say, yeah, about that. We did not mean you could do whatever you wanted. And this is where it puts limits on what the president can do as commander-in-chief, where he basically has 90 days where he can take whatever action he needs to. He has to inform Congress in a timely manner, and he has to seek authorization from Congress, or they cut the funds, right? And so basically it kind of adds some power back to Congress, kind of readjust the separation of powers. Now, again, I don't think it really gives a pure, Congress can declare war. We've still expanded the powers of the president. We've still given the president a lot more control as commander in chief. But you do kind of see that we've changed that. I corrected it a little bit, I think, but this is why we haven't really seen another officially declared war, because we haven't had that kind of situation yet. So by the time you get to 1974, American troops are out. And what you're going to see happening is that by August of 74, we're not sending any kind of military aid at all. No guns, no money, no nothing to South Vietnam. And then between 74 and 75, the North Vietnamese are going to start attacking South Vietnam until eventually they basically conquer South Vietnam. They take over Saigon. And in 1976, we'll see Vietnam as united once again, this time under a communist regime. And so for a lot of people, there's the sense of, why did we bother to fight there in the first place, right? If what we ended up with was a communist Vietnam, why did we have, almost 60,000 dead Americans? Why did we waste all that money? You're talking really, if you're talking about to 1973, you're talking from, like 9 years, 8 years, basically, mostly 9 years. of us fighting. And if you're talking about kind of from, if you think going back into the 1950s when Eisenhower started sending aid, this has been a long period of involvement. And what have we got to show for it? Communism has spread. We'll see that communism will again spread into Cambodia. Cambodia will have the Khmer Rouge, which will commit all kinds of atrocities and genocide. And so you're going to really see that there's the very wearied public, right? And a great deal of cynicism about the government and that kind of thing. And there's many historians and public policy people that really make the accurate case that this kind of hangover from Vietnam, the sense that we don't ever want another Vietnam, continues to shape our policy decisions regarding Iraq and Afghanistan even today. That when we get embroiled in these kind of ideological struggles where we're trying to support this concept of democracy and we're sending troops and we are dealing with people that maybe don't want us there, and maybe they don't want us there for the very practical reason that we're foreigners. Maybe it's because they had a relative accidentally get hurt, or maybe they really feel like they don't want our democratic system. Whatever it is, when people don't want us there, but we insist on being there for their own good, it's a problem. It's a difficult situation, and so we still kind of deal with this even today. And so Vietnam is a very tricky situation. And again, you really have, Eisenhower and Kennedy begin the support. LBJ is the one who really triggers the major, combat of Vietnam. And Nixon will be the one to try to finish it. And Nixon, for all that I'll get us out. I've got a plan. And his plan being Vietnamization, it's questionable as to how truly successful that really was. And so that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind. And so Vietnam is really kind of the last major conflict of the Cold War, in the sense of the last time you see the Americans using troops. So you have, the Cold War doesn't actually end until we get to, 89, 90, 91. But Vietnam is the last big conflict. And so you want to be sure you understand kind of the basic timeline, the presidents involved, the constitutional issues regarding the separation of powers and war powers, as well as the impact of the media in Vietnam and how it kind of shaped and changed public opinion. So that's it for the Cold War. We'll probably take a test at some point next week, the first week of April. I'm not sure exactly which day, if we'll do it Monday or Wednesday or something like that. And then we'll be following this one up with the civil rights movement and really kind of picking back up with LBJ and his domestic agenda, with a special emphasis on groups that will fight for civil rights. And we'll kind of take a broad view of civil rights that kind of snapshots that from the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s. And then we'll rewind a little bit and then talk more specifically about Nixon's domestic agenda. All right. And I think I probably kept this to 40 minutes maybe. So